So this is our bustier, our panel bustier, I think we've called it. So panel over the bust here, it's got a side seam, a side back seam, and then we put a zip in the back here. And this zip was just an open-ended zip that we had. You really need to source your zip and know what the length that's going to be. And then you can base your pattern on that length. So this one here is probably, this would be, so if you had an open-ended 25 centimeter open-ended zip, that would work well. So 25 centimeter open-ended zip for the block as is a good thing. And so here we've got our side panel. This one here, because it's just the toile, it's just interfaced on the inside, and we've got a Hong Kong bind around the edges. This isn't a way that you should finish the garment. This is literally just for the toile, so you've got something to look at and design around on the dummy. So you can see here, this is the one that we'll go through the construction of. So this is the side panel there, and the back panels. And you can see here we've actually we've got it backed in Shapewell. So the fabric itself is backed with a layer of interfacing on all of the pieces. Then we've cut the same panels in Shapewell, and we can give you some of that. And then we've put boning onto the side here. So that boning sits here beside the bust. And we also have boning going down onto the center front panel as well. So I never like having boning actually going over the bust line, because I just think it creates a ridge, and if the bust doesn't fit properly on the person, then you get, like their bust sitting inside this garment that's sort of like sitting out with this big heavy like line along it. So that's why I sew on either side of the bust. And the one at the back here, this is the center back, it also helps keeps the center back straight as well. And this is particularly good if you're having eyelets running down the back with a tie going across, because it means that it sits nice and straight and the back doesn't crumple up when it's on the body.
And how have you put that boning in there, Mark? Or are you going to?
So with the boning, if we have a look on here, so I haven't done the center front panel completely. So this is the outside fabric. I've used black interfacing in this instance. That's why there's the black on the other side. So we've got our panels here. So I've actually drawn on with pencil where I want the boning to sit.
And these are marked on the block, aren't they?
Yeah, these positions are marked on the block, so you can use those as a reference. It's good. What you need to think of too with your boning is that the boning needs to be at least, we have a 1 centimeter seam allowance here, and then the boning should sit 0.5 back from there. So don't have the boning going all the way to the stitch line, because then you'll end up with a lump there and it's really hard to sew. So what I've done on this side here is to sew down the center. So actually sew the boning onto the Shapewell, and then once that's in position, then we sit this on top, this strip, and this is just another strip of the Shapewell that I've cut on a straight grain, and we'll sew around to hold that in position. And then we've got our lining here. So the lining is just all of the pieces sewn together with 1 centimeter seam allowances. And once we've got the center front panel sewn and we've sewn it onto the side panels, then we'll talk about 2 ways of finishing the top and the bottom edge. Sometimes people, when they're sewing the boning on, they'll say that the boning should actually shape into the waist, so it should be sewn this way. I actually don't think it makes much difference because the thing is too, like, if it's going into the waist, but then it has to go over the bust. So if you do it, either way you do it, you'll have it going the wrong way for the bust or the waist. So, once it's on the body, it'll warm up and it'll actually mold more to the shape of the body anyway. So I think you can put it on either way myself. Well, sure other people will have things to say about that. So I've drawn my lines onto the Shapewell, and they're covered, so you could use chalk, but pencil's really nice and obvious. So I'm just literally sewing down the center of the boning onto the Shapewell. There'll also be people who'll say that you need to put something over the end here. There's, you know, 1,000,001 ways of doing all of this stuff. Well, this goes over, yeah, true. Actually, what I'll do now with this one here, because I need to sew up the side to sew that in place. Actually, let's see if it's going to work. Oh yeah, that's fine. When I did these other ones, I actually changed to a zipper foot, but this is actually working fine. So I've just got this side of the foot sitting on top of the boning, and the stitching. It doesn't have to be, you know, super tight or anything. It's really just a way of covering it up so that the boning can't rub on the lining and potentially rub holes in the lining. That's why we're putting this other layer on top. And you can be a bit scrappy with this sewing too, because it's all going to be on the inside and lined. So, and then you just trim back.
Like you're never scrappy with your sewing.
Well, I suppose there are different types of scrappy, maybe.
Yeah, this doesn't need to be perfect.
Yeah, exactly. This one I can't chop off because I've sewn all the way to the edge, so that's fine. All right, so now we've got our panel here, our center front panel, and we need to sew this on. Now, I want to have the boning facing the lining, so that you've got the flat side going against the outer garment here, and that helps to stop the boning like showing through the outer fabric and being obvious. And now I'm just stitching this on flat to this outer layer.
So when we talk about interlinings, this Shapewell section is an interlining.
Yeah, it is, yep. So it's just giving extra body to the fabric, supporting the shape. It's particularly good if if you're using an outer layer fabric that is actually quite soft, and the interfacing helps in regard to that as well. So it just gives you more body. And again, like there are lots of different ways of doing this. This is the way that I've done it and the way that works for me. So just and you can see here, like just pull the Shapewell flat, so there's no, because the thing is, the Shapewell seems to be a tiny bit narrower than the outer fabric. If I pull that over and match those lines up, then I get excess fabric on the outside. So just make sure that it's sitting nice and flat, and then we'll follow, when we stitch the panels, we'll actually follow the edge of the outer fabric. Yeah, we won't follow the Shapewell. Okay, so there's our piece sewn on there. Now we want to sew the panel. So this is our centre back. This is how it goes over the bust. So these need to sew together. I've just got a notch at the bust point and a notch at the waist here. It's really hard to try and sew, to pull this around, or is it? Which way would you do it, Libby? Would you do it with this on top? I think I'd usually do it with a straighter one on top, but
I mean, it's a little bit tricky whichever way you do it, I think. Especially once it's got the Shapewell in it.
Yes, because it does make it stiff. Yeah. Let's have a go. We'll do one way and one the other way. See how we go. So yes, you've got 2 layers of Shapewell here. You've got 2 layers of fabric and 2 layers of interfacing that you're sewing through. So it can get a bit chunky. And if you can't see, actually I do have my notch cut in the interfacing there. So what we'll have to do here is, as we come into the curve, we'll have to pull this around.
You could just do little short sections and really make sure the edges are together. Should be fine.
But you can see there, this edge is bigger than the stitch line, so just take it slowly. No smashing it out.
Definite fine motor skills here with the fingers doing a lot of the control.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, you're manipulating the fabric and how it all works together. Okay, so that worked pretty well. And you can see here that we've got the boning supporting each side, so that's holding this straight. This needs a good press and probably a clip. So what I'll do, I'll sew the other side on and I'll clip this and give it a press, and then I'll show you at that point again. So I've sewn the panel lines over the bust here, and this fabric is, it's a drill, but it's almost like a canvas, and with the Shapewell behind it, it's really, you know, quite stiff over the bust there. And what I found I had to do was using a what's it called, a tailor's ham. You know, I can actually get that right into that curve over the bust, so that I could open that seam up and press it all back, and I had to, you know, clip in as well to get around there. So of course, you know, it's going to depend on your fabric. I mean, maybe for this, maybe you could actually take the Shapewell out of over the bust, so it was literally just the fabric and the interfacing going over there. But I think once it's on the body, and you can see how, you know, like having the interface, the boning on both sides, you know, really helps to support that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to sew the lining in place. So this lining, I've just used a cotton lining. It's probably, I think it would be more comfortable, you know, than having a polyester lining. And polyester, you know, can be pretty weak as well. So this is actually a polycotton, but you know, which means it has some strength to it. But yeah, it's still comfortable to wear. So I think with this, I'm going to, because the lining is a bit wobbly, I think I'm going to sew with the lining underneath. So this is just a 1 centimetre seam allowance along the bottom here.
So they're like the stitch lines, just when you basted the...
Yeah, exactly. So that's it's just holding the Shapewell onto the outer fabric. You could put some pins in here if you want to line these edges up. So I'm going to show you, yeah, 2 different methods. So this is going to be along the bottom edge. This is just bagging out the garment with the lining fabric. And then on the top edge, I'll show you a like putting a French bind onto it. This Bustier pattern also has a shaped hemline as well, so that's something you can change as you go along. You don't need to keep that dip down in the front. So I've sewn that at 1 centimetre, and now I'm going to pull this back and I'm going to understitch along the bottom here. Now this understitching, because I'm putting a French bind on the top, this is really easy to do, this understitching along here. If you were to do, if you wanted to bag out the top and the bottom with lining, you could do this understitching. I'd probably start, in that instance, I'd probably bag it out from the top, the first, like attach this first and then understitch along that edge there. And then sew the lining onto the bottom edge, because then to do the understitching you actually have to get sort of like inside the tunnel to do that stitching. The reason I'm doing this first though is because I'm not, I'm going to use a French bind along the top edge, so I can do the understitching along this bottom edge here. Okay, so now that needs a good press. So just press that up there. So just a quick word about the back here. This pattern has been made, as you saw originally, that there was a zip up the back. So it's only a 1 centimetre seam allowance that folds back. If you were putting lacing up the back and you needed eyelets here, then you would bag out this edge. So you turn the lining back, stitch down there at 1 centimetre, and that'd be all folded under like that, and then you could put the eyelets in place. Keep in mind though that you do have that row of boning there, so potentially that would have to move over, and you also probably need to make a gap as well, because you need, because there's lacing going in there, and because this meets at the center back, you'd probably have to trim maybe like potentially 3 or 4 centimeters off the back and then have the eyelets along here. So maybe the boning might actually even end up on this panel, or it might end up like just on near the seam allowance there, so that it's actually, so the eyelets are here and then the boning is here to keep it straight. But anyway, that's something that is a design thing anyway. Okay, so with the back here, we've spoken about the eyelets, but if you were just having a zip here, then you could just have this back edge overlocked, so all of the layers overlocked together, and then the zip sewn on, and when that folds back, the overlocking would be hidden by the zip. Otherwise, you could put a binding along that edge as well. So do a Hong Kong bind along there that then sits behind the zip. And why I'm saying not to bag out the lining around the zip is that potentially if you need to alter it, if you've finished all of this and then you sew the zip on, it's really easy to alter the zip. You can just unpick the zip, you can move it over if you need to make it smaller, and then just restitch the zip and maybe do a little bit of hand finishing at the top and the bottom. Alright, so what I'm going to do now is just stay stitch the lining.
So what's happening on this bottom edge again, Mark?
This top edge.
Finish?
So this I'm going to do
the top edge.
the top edge, yeah. So I'm going to do a French bind
Yeah.
along this edge here, which is the same as a Hong Kong bind, but it's finished on the inside. It doesn't have the raw edge on the inside, which isn't a finish that you should be using on a corset. Because I'm sewing with the lining underneath, it means that I can actually manipulate the lining, because this is really stiff and isn't moving at all, but the lining has a bit of give in it, so just make sure you match things up and then manipulate the fabric as you go along.
Put a pin in there.
Yeah.
If you need to, it's a good idea.
There's boning in there. It's a bit tricky to maneuver. And of course this will look much nicer when you're sewing in a matching thread colour and not in a very obvious contrast. Okay, so I've stitched those two layers together. This is where you can trim things off a little bit. Any little bits of Shapewell that are sticking up, you can trim those off. So you've got a nice smooth line to attach your binding to. The other thing too about having a binding along the top edge here, and you don't have to bag out the bottom edge as well. You could have, like a binding at the top and a binding at the bottom. And I think that's something that's actually would be quite easy to remove if you needed to do alterations in the
For the shape.
yeah. Let's just check that this is going to be long enough.
So Hong Kong bind's done more on a seam allowance.
Yeah, so it's a Hong Kong bind is in
finish.
exactly a Hong Kong bind is in an internal finish. It's not an external finish. I'm going to sew this at 6mm because I've got these stitches along the top here. I don't want to. I was going to sew it just as a foot width, which is like 5mm, but I'm afraid then that you'd be able to see all of the stay stitching that I put in place. So I'm sewing it at 6mm, hoping that all of that stay stitching will be covered up. And by the way, this is this bias is a 3.5 centimeter wide bias that I've cut out of a semi-matching fabric anyway. And actually, I'm going to just sew this first bit again because I did start sewing it a bit narrower. Cool. So just go along and see. I've been very lucky, so I've managed to cover up all of these stay stitching, which is handy. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to take this to the iron and I'm going to fold this top edge in, and this is why too, when you're applying the bias, make sure that you don't stretch it, because then it'll be too thin and you won't have enough fabric here to actually turn back. So I'm going to press this, so pushing it up, pressing the top edge back so that the raw edges touch, and then this will be folded down here, and then when I stitch through here it'll catch on the other side, so you'll have it finished nicely on the inside and on the outside. So I'll just press this and then I'll come back and start sewing the bind down. So this edge here would already be finished, either overlocked or with the binding. And so what I've done, I've pressed the bias, sewn it on at 6mm, pressed it up, and then turned it back down so that these raw edges match. As I was going along, I just checked to make sure that this distance here was bigger than from the raw edge to the stitch line, so that when I folded that under, it would actually catch on the inside. So in a few places it took a little bit of manipulation, but I think it should be all right. So this center back here, like I said, this would already be finished. So I'm just tucking the edge of the binding under, and then under again at the back there. Another thing you can do too, if you want, is to actually stitch this on, and then you could fold this down and you could actually hand catch it on the inside as well, if you don't mind a bit of hand sewing.
Yeah, I'd probably put a pin in just at the start to avoid it doing that.
Yeah, so what I should be doing is actually lifting this up as I go along and seeing what's happening underneath.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
And I'm pushing it down. The other thing you could do, if you don't mind having a bit of top stitching on it, is actually, rather than ditch stitching, if you stitched on top of the on the top of the bias, then there's obviously even more chance that you'd catch it on the back.
And if you had the same stitch colour, that would look fine.
Yeah, exactly. Or you could even do, like you could have a contrast bias as well, so like actually make feature of it. So I'll just keep going with this, and I'll show each other at the end how well I've gone. So I've done the French bind along the top edge there, all the way along, and of course like I've sewn it in black, so it actually looks like a shadow now. The other thing too is that this this isn't the drill, this is actually a cotton poplin, so the shade is slightly different too, but I've given you some other options with the top stitching and the hand stitching on the inside. I did pretty well. Like, it's not something that I do a lot, so it's jumped off in one or two little spots, but all up it's pretty I think I've done pretty well. So that's the bustier. So that we've also talked about options for the centre back. This would be ready now, actually, if that was overlocked or bound, to put the zip in, making sure, that importance of having a zip that is the correct length as well. And I think too, if you end up with a zip that's shorter than you need, it's probably like not such a bad thing just to have the zip finishing up a little bit from the bottom, and then just having a little split from there down. That's what I would do. So it's always important to have it matching up at the top, but less important that it goes all the way to the bottom edge. So there's your bustier construction.